in my heart that night we'd take first place. There was something that he'd left behind, he'd fetch it back in town. Never dreamt it at the time that fate would strike him down. Oh, on the mountains when it didn't show. Found him in a ditch between here and Shaunavon. Smooth pavement and it's swiftly below. Sirens wail, the blizzard blows. But I grew old, and since that time I've come to think, when I see his name engraved on trophies or his picture in a case in the kinsman's ring, somehow slipped the bonds of time. He's gained self-renown, and I've started on that slow slide back, but he's forever in glory bound. Yeah, I've started on that slow slide back, but he's forever in glory bound. Steady hand with the clock. And once across the blue line, oh, he never let you down. You could tell by the look in his cold black eyes that boy was glory bound. To its feet with a golden old time. The scouts of pagan, sure enough, it was just a matter of time. There was any justice in this forever in glory bound. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 Johnny Mac lived in Maple Creek. He was lonely and tough. Level head and the steady hand and wizard with the puff. And once across the blue line, oh, he never let you down. You could tell by the look in his cold black eyes that boy was glory bound. To its feet with a golden time. The scouts had taken sure enough it was just a matter of time. If there was any justice in this world, he'd be picking second round. 'Cause he had the goods, there was no denying that boy was glory bound. lived near Maple Creek. It was lonely and tough. Level-head with a steady hand and hard. And once across the blue line, oh, he never let you down. You could tell by the look in his cold black eyes that boy was glory bound. He could bring the whole town to its feet with a golden time. Scouts and pagans, sure enough, it was just a matter of time. If there was any justice in this world, he could pick the second round. 'Cause he had the goods, there was no denying that boy was glory bound. One afternoon before a game, I stopped by Johnny's place. My father's car, the feeling in my heart that might take his place. There was something that he left behind. He'd fetch it back in town. Never dreamt it at the time that fate would strike him down. From the mountains made in the shore, down in a ditch between here and shore. Paved in its favor, sirens wail. Johnny died young, but I grew old, and since that time I've come to think, when I see his name engraved on trophies or his picture in a case of a kinsman's ring, somehow slipped the bonds of time between self-bred now. I've started on that slow slide back, but he's forever glory bound. I've started on that slow slide back, but he's forever glory bound. Ay, 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 lived near Maple Creek. He was lonely and tough, level-head with a steady hand and heart. And once across the blue line, oh, he never let you down. You could tell by the look in his cold black eyes that boy was glory bound.
I just started.
To its feet with golden time. Scouts and pagans, sure enough, they were just a matter of time. If there was any justice in this world, he'd be picked never dreamt it at the time that fate would strike him down. Now his man didn't show. He found him in a ditch between here and Shaunavon. We've paid millions for labor. Sideways way.
Good morning, folks. My name is Jim. Eric and I were neighbors who became friends, and it's a relationship I'll always cherish. I want to say thank you to everyone who's come today, and Robbie and the family want you to know how deeply they appreciate your being present, either here or virtually present. Not sure where the camera is. Okay, let's do something different right now. How about a vocal hug for the family? Can we do that? Repeat after me. We love you guys. We love you guys. Let's have a moment of silence. One's life is a gift shared. One's love is a gift to our hearts. Our souls are richer now. The sacred has come within. Now, though, for a while, we have to live with one's absence, and it's deeply felt because we deeply loved. A famous rabbi once wrote, "Remember your loved one is still a part of your life. The memory of the dead can indeed outlast the moments we erect for them." So coming together today is indeed for the family that's here. But I'd like to say that it's also for your friends, because we want to walk beside you on this part of the journey. We are your fellow travelers in this life, so please, lean on us. It's what we can do. You'll see on the program that it's going to be simple. There'll be readings, songs, and reflections, and they're all prepared. But also not on the program is there'll be a time to share, an open mic for everyone who wants to be spontaneous. So you might want to be thinking of some stories you want to share. And remember, those memories will be cherished by the family. So next, we'll have a reading by Eric's cousin and his wife, Mary. So that's Conrad and Mary Wright.
Good morning. I'm Conrad Wright, one of 6 Wright family cousins of Eric. As many of you know, the Wright family has a long-time love affair with the state of Maine. In part, it's genealogical. Our grandmother, Elizabeth Longfellow Woodman, was born in Portland and had ancestry going back to the 18th century. Our grandfather had family ties to Castine. In part, it also has to do with a special place. In the summer of 1903, grandfather decided to spend his time in Paris, Maine, on Paris Hill. He had such a good time, he enjoyed it so much that he decided at the end of the season to buy a little farmhouse. He and his mother named the farmhouse Windy Ledge. There are now 3 family houses on the side of a hill. A dirt road connects them with a memorable view of the White Mountains. Some years ago, a member of our family ran across a short poem, and it seemed to express the feelings that we all felt for Maine and for Windy Ledge. And we've used it very often on occasions such as this one. So Mary and I would like to share it with you now. This is Mountain Creed by Medora Addison Nutter. This is the place I love. Here I belong on this high hillside farm I thought I owned until I found it was the farm owned me, and rights I took for granted were but loaned.
These mountains are a very part of me, these rocky pastures and this stubborn soil, these woods that won't stay cut. These crumbling walls mean more to me than unremitting toil.
For here I find not loneliness, but peace. Here silence is transmuted into song. Here grief forgets to twist the tired heart. This is the place I love. Here I belong.
We'll now be favored by a series of reflections by Eric's only sibling, his sister, Carolyn Kuhl, and followed by Thomas Tam, who is a good colleague and friend of Eric's, and then Joshua and Douglas, and then Robbie, and then we'll go into our sharing time. So is Carolyn Kuhl here? Did I say that wrong? Caroline? Sorry.
Eric, my brother, and I were born 2 years, 9 months apart. One of my early recollections is when he was beginning to talk. My parents were not able to understand him, but I, being closer to him in age, could. I became his interpreter to get his wants and needs known. So he communicated through me. As we all know, he became a great communicator without me. I have so many memories of our childhood. The summertime was best because we would go to our family home, Windy Ledge in Maine. Down the lane from us was a family that had twins, a year younger than I was. The twins, Eric and I, had wonderful times during the summer months, doing practically everything together. We had a baseball field with a dugout we built. We made a trail, the cobweb trail, with the initials of everyone who helped make it, in the woods. We put on plays and we climbed mountains. In those summers, Eric played a lot of golf at the local golf course. One thing that amused our father was the time he was at the golf club and someone said, "Oh, you're Eric's father." Dad wasn't used to being recognized because of his son. Not on his own accord. One time we were climbing Mount Washington with our parents and uncle. Eric declared that he felt like a hot dog, to which Uncle Brooks quickly responded, "You don't look like one." So Eric's love of hiking started at a very young age as well. Eric has always been interested in sports. I can even take credit in his baseball skills. I taught him how to catch a ball when I would toss to him. Granted, he soon grew old enough to outplay me. I remember going to his high school basketball games. He was also on the school golf team, and we would go to his Little League games. His ice skating wasn't as good as then, falling and breaking an arm, which he let the doctor put back in place without anesthesia at Eric's assistance. Obviously, the break was a simple one that could be realigned easily. He had a collection of years and years of Sports Illustrated dating back to his high school days. These are now stored at Windy Ledge. I don't know how much he liked reading back then, but he had said he didn't care to read much in his younger years until he discovered books that finally held his interest and how much wealth of information he could gather from them. However, I do remember a phase when James Bond books were all he read. But later in life, I rarely saw him without a book in hand or nearby, and his collection of books on golf was extensive. One pride he had was keeping our 1939 Ford Woody up and running and driving it on the roads of Maine. When we were young, we would ride on Lena's tailgate with the twins, having a good old time. I can only imagine what kind of trouble we'd get into these days if we pulled the same stunt. And not only was it fun, but we all survived. As a fourth grader, he had a paper route, which he managed really well. I would help him, and when he went to collect the money due in the dead of winter, we weren't usually asked to come in from the cold. I remember we tried to warm our hands under one home's clothes dryer's vent outside. He paid me for helping him deliver the papers and did that fairly. Honesty is the best policy was what we learned growing up. These are memories that I cherish. Eric was a kind, loving, smart individual. He led an exemplary life and his passing is a loss to everyone. He will be greatly missed.
Good morning, my name is Tom. First, I want to thank Robbie for asking me to speak on behalf of Eric. It's a privilege and an honor to celebrate a remarkable life and a remarkable man. Thank you very much, Robbie. I met Eric shortly after coming out of law school in the state's attorney's office of Montgomery County in 1978. Somebody do the math, because that's the reason I went to law school, and I have no idea how many years that is. Most people would better recognize our office as the local district attorney's office. Eric quickly started referring to me as T squared, and I called him EEW, and we referred to each other that way until the very end. Can I just also tell you that getting old stinks, and I don't recommend it. So please permit me to make my dry mouth a little more easy to understand. Montgomery County is a huge suburb of DC. It's now the largest county in the state of Maryland. Robbie, since you and Eric were there, it's now over 1 million people. It's grown exponentially since Eric and Robbie lived there. You may recognize towns names such as Bethesda, Rockville, and Chevy Chase. The life of a young prosecutor can be exciting, challenging, and rewarding career for newly minted attorneys. You earn your bones as an aspiring trial lawyer. Eric and I would handle dockets of 30 to 50 misdemeanor cases set before a judge, no jury. And the cases consisted of shopliftings, assault and batteries, simple drug possessions, and my personal favorite, in fact, I handled so many of these, Claire thought it was becoming my specialty, weenie waggling, better known as indecent exposure. Eric and I were privileged to work for a boss, the elected state's attorney, who was ahead of his time in many ways. I just shared the news of Eric's passing with Andy, who is still around. He's got to be in his late 80s. And he immediately remembered what a great writer he was. Andy said Eric did a lot of writing for him. And Andy went on to become an appellate judge who wrote appellate opinions, so you know he would recognize a very good writer. Many people harbor the misconception that a prosecutor is always just trying to obtain a conviction, but that is absolutely not true. Eric and I were expected to use our discretion, our judgment about whether a person should even be charged with a crime, whether the cops had conducted an illegal search and seizure or had not read a defendant their Miranda warnings. I quickly discerned that Eric was incredibly bright, extremely well-read, knew Maryland case law much better than I, was highly ethical and a man of unwavering principles. We could drop cases on our own authority. We could refer people for drug treatment or alcohol treatment. We sincerely believed we were trying to keep the community a little safer and that we were fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. In fact, our boss made sure that we all visited a prison to see the cages that we put human beings in, surrounded by walls of razor wire and barbed wire, before he permitted us to go into a courtroom and ask a judge to put someone in jail. We were taught to always remember that a criminal defendant was somebody's husband, son, brother, sister, and that no man or woman was an island. We worked hard, we partied hard. We had an office softball team. I want to thank Caroline for teaching him how to catch so well. He was a very good first baseman. We also played regular basketball up at the police training academy. And we would regularly retire across the street at an eating establishment and imbibe a few adult beverages. For some reason, I developed a beer belly, but EEW always stayed thin. Can someone please explain that to me? Andy thought so highly of Eric that he was selected to attend a highly regarded career prosecutor course, which was offered in a large metropolis in the Deep South in the dead of summer. Eric sent back a postcard that was put on the bulletin board for all in the office to see, describing the course location as, well, dystopian, a hellhole, a place with no zoning, with gas stations next to skyscrapers, next to strip joints, and the heat was so unbearable, you basically went from the dorm to the classes and back to the air conditioning in the dorm. The postcard was hilarious. It might have displeased the boss for spending part of his office budget to send Eric for such a horrible experience. And oh, by the way, Doug, the city was Houston, Texas. I mentioned how bright EEW was, and quite honestly, I was somewhat of a DC snob. I would drive past Baltimore on 95 on my way to beautiful New England and look down my nose at what seemed to be the perpetual smog that laid over the city of Baltimore. But of course, over the years, I learned to enjoy our trips to Baltimore to see his beloved Orioles. I remember Old Memorial Stadium, where you had to park in city neighborhoods, where kids would offer to clean your windshield for money, or your car might not be in the same shape after you got back from the game. Please tell me that he made it to Camden Yards, still one of the coolest and most original, set the trend for baseball stadiums across the country. Now, I think a lot of people know Hopkins had a great hospital, but I had no idea how great an undergraduate school Johns Hopkins was until my youngest son had the privilege of attending. And I learned that Eric indeed had attended one of the top universities in the world. One of my first memories of working with Eric was him training me in the courtroom. He assigned me to try a case with an eyewitness. We were before a stern and unsmiling judge. And Eric, as always serious and professional and professorial, leaned in and whispered, "The judge likes baseball, so use a baseball reference to place the distance between the witness and their view of the crime." I followed his advice. We got a little wry smile from his taciturn jurist. I don't remember whether we won the case, but we got a little smile. Which brings me to EEW's dry wit, noted in the beautifully written obituary. Dry? Did someone say dry? It was as dry as the Sahara Desert, as parched as Death Valley. Others of my colleagues remembered it as somewhat acerbic, caustic, intense, dry as dry before we knew anything about climate change. Now, in an effort to kind of speak in the vernacular, the parlance of the day, or as the kids would say, to keep it real, let's stipulate that Eric's personality was, how should I say this diplomatically, was not everyone's cup of tea, not everyone's jam, not to everyone's liking. He could be a curmudgeon, kind of crabby, which is why I wore a Maryland blue crab tie. And he did not suffer fools gladly. Can I ask you, who does suffer fools gladly? If you didn't like him, that was fine. He could care less. As one former colleague, Jack Hanley, said, he was hard to work with, but he was my friend. If you could get past the rough exterior, he was a great guy, and he would be my lifelong friend. I recently retired, and Claire and I took our longest trip in several years to Seattle to see the Hopkins Sun and to stop in Denver, and we'd hoped to see Robbie and Eric there together. We had unfortunately missed them on their trip to their summer to Windy Ledge in Maine. I had a medical procedure scheduled the day that that they were to be in DC, and I assured them we would see him in Denver. But when we arrived that day was the day that Robbie left for Josh's wedding, which I understand was a joyous event despite the sad circumstances. Claire and I drove over to see where Eric and Robbie lived, just to try to make some sort of spiritual connection. It would have been great to see the two of them together at least one more time. And Claire, despite our recent cross-country travel, to her everlasting credit, did not hesitate to schedule this trip to attend this celebration because she knew how much I cared about Eric. When EEW was promoted to the circuit court, part of the DA's office, the jury trial level, he was famous for trying the first case in Maryland where the victim's body was never recovered. Please permit me to quote his supervisor and friend, Matt Campbell. Eric's handling of the Hurley case was extraordinary. It was, I believe, the first conviction ever in Maryland for a homicide without a body proving the death. Plus, Hurley suborned the perjured testimony of his girlfriend to establish an alibi. Eric had to work with Hurley's daughter, who was about 5 or 6 years old at the time, to testify against her father. We were all quite proud of Eric. He obtained a conviction, and I think as Robbie and Eric were leaving Maryland, they went to listen to the appellate argument in that case. Matt recounted another time in the early 80s when he and Eric were coming back from a rafting excursion in West Virginia with the 2 first black state troopers who had ever been hired in the state of Maryland. They stopped in a small Maryland town, Hancock, for a meal. The all-white wait staff clearly gave them the racist, big, slow service. They discussed how to react, and Eric had the most extreme suggestions. When the bill finally came, Eric stood up, said he would settle up with the others when and if they were able to get back to the car alive. I ended my career as an assistant public defender in the jurisdiction that encompassed that small town. In fact, I had defended 2 murder cases. And I'm here to tell you that in the year of our Lord, 2020, they still have Confederate flags flying proudly on the back of pickup trucks in Hancock, Maryland. Quite frankly, it's kind of hard to believe. I've written down an expression, but I don't think the chaplain would like for me to say that in a church. Robbie told me she and E were recently able to catch concerts by Jimmy Buffett and John Prine at Red Rocks. We were able to visit Red Rocks on our trip to Denver, and how I wish I could have seen those shows with Robbie and EEW. If you're not familiar with the songs of John Prine, look him up on YouTube. He has a slightly more comprehensible voice than Bob Dylan, because Bob Dylan said Jimmy Buffett was one of his favorite songwriters. I think I skipped a page. One final recollection regarding EW. I did skip a page, I apologize. He and the boys came to visit about 5 or 10 years ago, and Eric wondered if there was a golf course the boys could play while he came over to visit. I replied the county had just reopened and renovated a public course very near my house. After the round, I asked how the boys liked the course, and he told me it was nothing special. I have to admit my feelings were hurt. I had no idea I was dealing with a future golf course architect, a future golf course pro, and a former colleague who plotted family trips around well-known courses. The course was public. It was 5 minutes from my house, Josh and Doug. I humbly apologize for sending you to those inferior lengths. I know some people who may be able to get you on to the U.S. Open course at Congressional the next time you visit the D.C. area. EEW and I also shared a love of folk and rock music. We were early fans of Jimmy Buffett and would go to concerts and then discuss the set list, which different songs he played. Bob Dylan has said Buffett was one of his favorite songwriters. Of course, no one can understand a damn word Dylan says, so he may have been discussing a breakfast buffet. As I have already said, Robbie told me she and E were recently able to catch concerts by Buffett and Prine. If you're not familiar with Prine, he has a slightly more comprehensible voice than Dylan, suffered from throat cancer, and that made it even more raspy. And he also has a dry sense of humor that reminds me so much of Eric. One might even say it's a dry wit. This verse reminds me so much of Eric and his view of life as well as my own. That's the way that the world goes round. You're up 1 minute, the next you're down. It's a half an inch of water, and you think you're going to drown. That's the way that the world goes round. One thing I've learned, much as the chaplain referred to, is you have groups of friends. For me, they happen to, I'll get back to the chaplain in a second. Groups of friends, for me, it happens to be law school, people, some places I've worked, but those who you thought were good friends frequently in a workplace just disappear as soon as you leave an office. On the other hand, EEW was a true, steadfast, valued, and lifelong friend. One thing I have learned from my kids' generation, that they can tell friends that they love them. It's not just have to be in a family setting, as the chaplain mentioned. In fact, tell them when their ears can hear and their hearts can warm to the joyful knowledge that they are loved. Eric, I loved you, buddy. Eric was a great lawyer, a great friend, a lifelong public servant. That is indeed a life to celebrate. On Radio Margaritaville, when they celebrate someone passing away, they said, "Sail on," because of Jimmy's love of the ocean. EEW, keep them in the fairways and stay up there on Windy Ledge forever. Peace and love.
Thank you, Tom, for that lovely, lovely eulogy. That was very, very touching, and still trying to process it all, but lots of good stories that I'd hoped I'd hear. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here today to celebrate and memorialize the life of my father, Eric. He was known as many things to you all: Eric, Mr. Wright, Professor Wright, Bearcat, or as he was so proud of in the Scandinavian tradition, Farfar. But to me, he was always just Dad. So if it's all right, I'd like to talk to you about my dad and what he meant to me, some of my favorite times and memories with him, and how proud I am of the way that he carried himself in the face of such adversity right up to the end. Dad, you were always there for us, but me in particular. I fondly recall typical father-son activities, playing catch in the backyard, raking leaves together every fall, going on bike rides around the neighborhood and surrounding area, for instance. But it wasn't always that easy for him. I admittedly wasn't always the smartest or most responsible kid, and he always seemed to be helping me get out of trouble, or at least dampen the blows of my bad decisions. A joke, I always asked my mom for forgiveness and my dad for help. But it's true. He was a man of great principle, but also never-ending love. I knew I could always count on him to have my back. Without getting into details, let's just say that his legal training came in handy on a few occasions during my teenage years. As touched on by Tom, he was an extremely talented attorney with a sharp wit, a knack for details, a voracious reader, and a lifelong learner, and a very highly skilled writer. I was proud of him for the successful career he forged in a bitter, thankless world full of bad guys, as he'd like to say. I say this in jest, but his skill in the courtroom may have inadvertently trickled down and led to a bit of an inflated sense of correctness at all times in my own mind. As my brother hinted at in his best man speech a few weekends ago, I suspect my desire to win every debate I was party to may have stemmed from my desire to be like him. Some other random things that I loved about him. He was a great planner who never let a little rain get in the way of some well-laid plans, as many hikes and rounds of golf played throughout that rain would attest to. He loved maps. I joyfully recall taking a new back road when possible and watching my dad dutifully highlight in his beloved Deloitte, Maine gazetteer the road that he had taken. When helping with this pursuit of the unseen, he had a wonderful and innate sense of direction, something my brother and I have thankfully acquired from him. Caitlin will attest to my love of Google Maps, which I often spend hours studying before going to a new destination or a new golf course. I have my dad to thank for that. He used to send me unnamed satellite images of golf courses in college and see if I could figure them out from their simple famous features. I always loved getting those envelopes. Most of the time I could figure them out, but every once in a while he would stump me. Those traits often manifested themselves in larger bucket list type trips as well. Adventurous hikes in the White Mountains of Maine and New Hampshire, conquering the tallest mountains in the Northeast, such as Mount Washington and Mount Katahdin. Long road trips to see the country's national parks, monuments, and in particular, Major League Baseball stadiums. 18 of 32, I believe, we visited together. Or self-planned golf excursions to far-flung locations such as Ireland, Scotland on multiple occasions, and Bandon Dunes, just to name a few. It is with great fondness that I remember a trip that we took to Ireland upon my high school graduation. Just him and his two boys. Our first round was at an impossibly difficult modern links entitled the European Club, built by a fellow named Pat Ruddy. Upon the completion of our first round of true links golf, my brother and I returned to the pro shop. Battered but not beaten, though certainly chilled by the bone-cutting wind that day. Who should be working inside but the owner and builder himself, Mr. Ruddy? After a brief conversation, Pat offered my brother and I each a souvenir hat from the pro shop. I selected a navy winter knit hat, thinking it practical if such wind would be sustained throughout our trip. I still have that hat. I recount that story because it was one of my dad's favorites. He relished that moment, I think, that such a local legend would take the time out of his busy schedule to chat up a few lads from America, fresh off the links for the first time, and just show us such graciousness and kindness. Another story that my dad loved recollecting involved a visit to Yankee Stadium to see his beloved Orioles play. Tom touched on it. Someone has to talk about his love for the Orioles, so I'm going to oblige, as they were also my first baseball love. My allegiances have switched over to the Red Sox, but I was absolutely an Orioles fan as a kid, and at the time that I most loved baseball. I wore number 8 for our favorite player, Cal Ripken Jr., who I still remember watching break Lou Gehrig's streak together with my dad on TV. I played shortstop just like him, and I still have my baseball card collection with over 100 Cal Ripken cards that I'm going to hold on to for a while longer because my dad always used to say he was sorry he still didn't have his when we were kids. So, sorry, Caitlin, I think we're going to have to just keep those boxes in storage for a little longer. Anyways, my dad loved the Orioles, so much so that we placed one of his 2 Orioles watches that he'd acquired in the urn that we have with him to be buried so that he'll always know when it's game time. Anyways, back to my story. We were at Yankee Stadium. We'd gone down to the dugouts for warm-ups, hoping to catch a closer glance at the players in the field. As warm-ups were ending, the great slugger Rafael Palmeiro was walking off the field with a ball in his glove. I was the only kid in an Orioles shirt in a sea of Yankees fans, and as Rafi walked off the field, I shouted, "Hey, Mr. Palmeiro, can I have a ball?" He stopped, looked through the sea of bodies, and pointed at the only kid in an Orioles shirt, me. He threw the ball up towards me, but before I could catch it, an older, larger kid next to me extended their mitt out and scooped it out of midair. Mr. Palmeiro saw all of this unfold, stopped, he pointed, shouted, "No, give it to him," pointing at me. Feeling the wrath of a major league superstar, the older kid dutifully obliged, much to the joy of my father, who stood closely behind watching it all unfold. I was certainly giddy by the prize I'd scored that day, but I think my dad was most happy for other reasons. He was just glad that his young baseball-loving son didn't have his joy shattered that day, and that none other than Rafael Palmeiro had come to my defense. Though my dad's great sports passions were baseball and golf, he also took pretty well to one that my brother and I forged on our own growing up. And that was a major part of our childhood, and one that I believed he thoroughly loved watching us play. That sport was hockey. He admittedly didn't love the cold of the ice rinks, but I think he got used to it after a little while. He was an absolute trooper with our hockey schedules, travel schedules. We played year-round, so it was a lot. Though it was mostly my mom's job to wake us up for early morning practices, my dad was always a mainstay at the rink. He chose to be our official high school scorekeeper. My mom insists so that he could get away from the gossip of the other parents, but I also think that he loved being a part of the game. being useful and being engaged in a way that cheering alone could not provide. A few stories I'll never forget about hockey. First, my dad was quite a snorer, but never so much so that I couldn't sleep through it. Till one weekend in an away tournament, we decided to share a room with another player and his father. All three of them turned out to be snorers, quite loudly. So fast forward to the morning, me being nowhere to be found. Finally, they decided to check the bathroom as the door was shut tight. Lo and behold, there I was, sound asleep in the bathtub behind the shower curtain with a towel for a pillow. I guess the snoring had been so bad that I sought refuge in the middle of the night. That was something my dad never let me live down. And to be honest, nor I him, so reminded him of that story often. A few years later, I was the only freshman to make the varsity hockey team. Balancing playing time is a hard job for any coach. That said, my dad did not think that I was getting anywhere near enough playing time. The coach instead continuing to play seniors who were admittedly maybe not as good, but had paid their dues. At the time, however, I didn't have the luxury of perspective that I might have now, and after a few games, I recall letting my frustration out in the car ride home after a game. My dad quietly commiserated with me and said he agreed, but that life wasn't always fair and to keep playing my hardest so that the coach would have to notice. I still don't know if or when he said anything to our coach that year, but I do know my playing times soon started to increase and that we had a new coach the following year. Not insinuating thing, but I'm not insinuating anything, so make of it what you will. But one thing I can tell you, something that almost all of these stories highlight in my mind, was that my dad did not like feeling as though his kids, or any kids for that matter, but particularly his kids, were being slighted or overlooked. He truly felt that we were capable of anything and could do anything that we put our minds to. Dad, you were always there for us, teaching us perseverance, hard work, and attention to detail. You were always my champion and so proud of us and what we had accomplished. You truly were our #1 fan. You were my favorite editor of all of my college papers, and I know you thoroughly enjoyed helping me through my senior dissertation, study of political activism and folk music spanning the works of Woody Guthrie and two of his favorites, Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen. You taught me about great music. You would have been so proud of our first dance 2 weeks ago to get today to If I Needed You by Townes Van Zandt, one of your favorites and someone I'm so proud that you introduced us to. To have seen Mom and I dancing to Angel from Montgomery by John Prine would have also made you smile immensely. While we were on the subject, I'm so glad to have had the time we had together the last few years in Denver. From seeing John Prine's Lost concert together at Red Rocks, to occasionally playing the Little Par 3 course at Green Valley Ranch where I work and witnessing him make one more birdie one last time, to Dead and Company in Boulder, to a number of Avalanche and Rockies and DU hockey games, to even convincing him to attend a few of my men's league hockey games, even if the product was quite diminished from our glory days. But for old time's sake, he enjoyed it. I know it brought you great joy seeing DU win the national championship last year, so they have a player named Cameron Wright on their team who he was especially fond of. That was weeks before the Avalanche won the Stanley Cup. My mom and him shared a memorable night seeing the Avs play in the Western Conference Finals. And as recently as this past July, we were still watching live music and sharing beers together and doing a lot. Which brings me to my final thoughts. It's hard to believe that you're gone while we were still doing so much so recently. But your decline and pain and suffering at the end brought us all so much sadness that I'm glad that you have found peace again finally. You were so strong and fought so hard against an invisible enemy, even up until your last day. I know you were still fighting to get better and stronger and fight on. With that in mind, I want to say just how much admiration I have for my mom for always being his advocate and best friend and caregiver, insisting that he be at home up until the very end. One final thought. A couple of days before he passed, my dad commented on how he wanted to go over to the golf course and hit some putts on the putting green. Surely he could do that still, he thought. While his body and his mind in many ways started to elude him, he was still intent on one more trip to the golf course. Dad, you'll always be with us, and even more so, every time that we tee it up. I love you, Dad.
How do you reduce 74 years of life experience into a few minutes of words? How do you select which moments to share from 35 years of memories with a loved one? Those are the two questions I have struggled to answer in the last few weeks. Since my dad's death, I have spent nearly every free moment reflecting on his life. The following are some of the memories that came to mind, and I hope by sharing they will do justice to the life my dad lived. My dad was a baby boomer. This was demonstrated by the fact that he actually knew how to build and fix things, something that can't always be said about succeeding generations. Growing up, I remember going with him to the auto parts store on Bath Road so he could get oil and oil filters for his car, which he changed himself. If we were lucky, he would drive my brother and me through the car wash across the street, which we thought was magical. Although not a craftsman by trade, Dad was a magician with his hands and mind. He installed a zip line for us in the backyard. He built a backstop for our homemade baseball diamond at Windy Ledge. He restained our 1939 Ford Woody station wagon himself. And he constructed the most amazing two-story treehouse at our home on Micmac Lane, complete with a rope ladder, stairs, and a fireman's pole. He did all of that almost entirely independently, measuring and sawing the lumber, designing the fastenings, and determining which hardware to use, even though he wasn't a professional carpenter. He had an uncanny ability to visualize things in his mind and had the skills to not only execute his vision, but built things to last. As many know, Dad had a successful career as a criminal prosecutor for the state of Maine. Mom probably remembers the midnight phone calls and his recollection of grim trips to crime scenes. What I remember from those years was his blue Ford Crown Victoria, which the state had assigned to him and very much resembled a police cruiser. I remember driving around in the big sedan thinking we were untouchable. Dad didn't do a good job to dispel the myth, as he did occasionally abuse his power. He was required to carry a badge with him, and if he saw someone on the road that he deemed was traveling too fast or irresponsibly, he would simply pull up alongside them, flash the badge, and they would instantly slow down. In reality, as an attorney, he actually had no legal ability to pull someone over for a road violation, but he got a kick out of tricking people into thinking otherwise. Speaking of operating vehicles, Dad was notorious for driving with his knees instead of his hands, which he was able to do with ease because of his long legs. Additionally, he would read legal briefs and even make notes in the margins and underline sentences, all while behind the wheel. More recently, he would criticize me for using my cell phone while driving, which I always found hypocritical because for years he was the king of distracted drivers. There is no doubt my dad loved being on the open road. He kept a road atlas of the state of Maine and would highlight every road he had ever driven on. When he traveled for work or for pleasure, he would consult his map and point the car in the direction of an uncharted path. I attempted to do the same when I was in high school and college, but soon gave up because the number of highlights in my map would never compare to my dad's. Even in his later years, when traveling to visit me and Harper in Texas, or going back to Windy Ledge with Mom for the summer, he brought with him a collection of paper road maps. We always explained to him that he had the world's most accurate map accessible on his phone, but he was steadfast in his approach. Another road trip staple was his music selection. He wasn't inclined instrumentally, but Dad loved his music, particularly folk rock. He would bring a pile of CDs with him wherever he went. He never owned an iPod. He never discovered streaming music, despite our attempts. Until the day he died, he still carried around with him a portable CD player, which as his son I found endearing, and as a millennial I found utterly psychotic. Early in my life, we listened to a lot of vinyl music. This was on the tail end of the classic rock days, so Dad would play us a lot of music from groups such as the Rolling Stones, Dire Straits, and the Band. He would often put music on during dinner, and I have a lot of vivid memories enjoying meals such as fondue, while Mark Knopfler's soothing voice belted Walk of Life in the background. My dad had a number of other interests. He loved baseball, especially baseball stadiums, as been noted. At the age of 13, we took a 3-week road trip, weaving through the upper Midwest, turning around in Colorado, and continuing a southern track to the mid-Atlantic. Along the way, we stopped at a dozen baseball stadiums so my dad could check them off his list. As children, we played the game of pickle in the backyard for hours on end until there was no light left in the day. And for many years, he was the coach for me and my brother in our local Little League. My best friend, Alex Babin, who's here today, reminded me the other day that he actually met my dad before he met me. Alex had just moved to Brunswick, and he was signing up for baseball, and my dad was working the sign-up table. When he saw Alex's last name, he said, "Hey, I've seen that name on the back of a hockey jersey." Sure enough, Dad had remembered Alex from a Bangor youth hockey game. It wasn't until after Alex and I met that he put 2 and 2 together. That was the type of person my dad was. For one, he had an uncanny knack for remembering seamlessly mundane facts. But more importantly, he left an indelible impression on many of our friends and youth. He became a role model for not just me and my brother, but for many other children as well. My dad would be surprised and pleased at the number of kind words I have received from friends in the last few weeks, with reminiscences on the subtle but important impact Dad made on their lives. Another passion of Dad's was photography. He had a keen eye for arranging images, and despite his seemingly regimented life as an attorney, he had an incredible artistic side to him, and he demonstrated a wonderful sense of imagination and creativity. Some of his photos still adorn the walls of his and my mom's house in Denver. In high school, he loaned me his 35mm Ricoh camera for my photography class, and a passion that still burns was lit in myself. I don't have as many opportunities to pursue photography these days, but every time I look through a viewfinder, I am reminded of my dad. Then there was hiking, a Wright family tradition that has been passed down for generations. The number of miles logged and peaks bagged as a family are too long to list. Most hiking trips centered around the family farm, Windy Ledge, which served as a jumping-off point for the White Mountains of New Hampshire and western Maine. I think my dad mostly enjoyed the simplistic qualities that the mountains and the farmhouse provided, the idyllic, quiet, and peaceful setting. But I also think he had a more profound connection with the outdoors and appreciation of the complex dynamics between man and nature. When you spend long periods of time in the woods or at the top of a distant mountain peak, it's easy to gain a deeper knowledge of how humans fit into the history of the earth. The natural world existed long before human beings and will exist long after us, and is a truth my dad understood well. He was not a religious person or even particularly spiritual, but he understood humans' place in the natural world, and it helped craft his view of life. I was fortunate enough to go on one final hike with my dad 3 summers ago. He struggled a bit, but with a little help we made it to the top of Streaked Mountain near South Paris. Despite his rapidly advancing Parkinson's, he did surprisingly well, and we spent about 30 minutes at the summit gazing across to Mount Washington and the Presidential Mountains. I tried to soak in the moment, knowing then that this would likely be my dad's last peak. Admittedly, I was distracted by the beautiful view. Last summer, my mom, my dad, my daughter Harper, and I made it to the summit of Mount Washington by 3 different modes of transportation. I hiked to the top. My mom drove the car up the auto road, and my dad took the cog railway with Harper. There wasn't a whole lot that got my dad excited the last few years, but he was thrilled about the prospect of taking Harper on the railway and had planned it for months. His own father had a passion for trains and mountains, and the opportunity to share the experience with Harper meant a lot to him, even if he didn't express it in so many words. Lastly, but certainly not least, was his deep love of golf, which was second only to his passion for law. He introduced my brother and me to the game around the ages of 6 or 7, and we instantly fell in love. Many of my fondest golf memories include my dad. He caddied for me when I won the club championship at Brunswick Golf Club. We played together when I shot my all-time best round of 67, and we shared each other's company on numerous golf vacations that included destinations such as the Canadian Maritime and Bandon Dunes in Oregon. Dad didn't just love to play golf. He was also a student of golf course design and architecture. He has a golf course architecture book collection that would put even the most consummate professional to shame. As a child, we would spend hours on end designing and drawing fictitious golf courses on poster boards. By the age of 10 or 12, I had determined that I wanted to be a golf course architect when I grew up, and have since turned it into a lifelong passion. I continued dabbling in design over the years, occasionally assisting my friend, a golf course architect in Portland, with drawings and plans. But for the most part, my profession is largely focused on the construction side of the golf course industry. Earlier this year, I was approached by another friend, the major champion professional Hal Sutton, to help him co-design a new course in Texas. Just this past Monday, we officially broke ground. I am saddened that my dad didn't live to see the final product, but I am happy he was still alive to review the plans and discuss the upcoming project. I hope there are many more projects to come, and I know my dad will be with me in spirit each step of the way. There are so many things I owe to my father. Not only did we share a multitude of interests, but he also shaped who I am as an individual. My dad was the most honest, fair, hardworking, and responsible person I've ever known. This probably explains why he was so successful as an attorney. As a lawyer, you are legally obligated to meet an ethical standard, or you risk losing your law license. The qualities that my dad exuded transitioned perfectly to the law profession. They also transitioned equally well to his personal life as a father, a husband, and a farfar. I know he was proud of all of us and loved and cared deeply for his family. I could not have asked for a better role model, and if nothing else, he has shown me how to be the best father possible.
I'm Robbie, sometimes known as Roberta, but to most people, I'm Robbie. I want to thank the Unitarian Universalist Church for allowing us to gather here. Though we were not official members, we visited often with his parents, and I spent hours here with many people in this audience working on Midcoast New Mainers Group. So it feels like home, and I know Eric would be comfortable to be here. And I also want to thank our good neighbor and friend, Jim Broussard, for helping lead this celebration of Eric's life. Eric was so fond of you and Pam, and I know he would be pleased. Before I begin the rest of it, I finally want to thank all of you for joining our family here and wrapping your love around us. I think Eric might be surprised at how many folks have come from near and far to celebrate his life. Though they say it takes a village to raise a child, I firmly believe it takes a village to help accept the loss of a loved one, like someone we all cherished. I'll do my best to share my life with Eric, but I won't be too long. I know my boys and his sister have done a wonderful job. I met Eric in the summer of 1980, and we would be married 39 years this November. We met in the old-fashioned way, a setup with a high school friend and my colleague from Albany for a blind date that required me to drive in the pouring rain from Albany to South Paris. And we spent those first many days at Windy Ledge. I was not the guest his parents expected when they arrived later that evening and saw my New York license plate. And I wasn't a he, as he pointed out, but a she. We hit it off for fineness for Maine, due to my college roommate, who I had visited multiple times in Maine, and our love of baseball. Our next 2 weekends included trips to the Bronx and Baltimore to see his beloved Orioles. It was a good time for a New York-Washington romance, as People's Express ran those $29 flights from New York to Baltimore. But after 2 years of these travels back and forth, I finally asked one night if we were going to get married, because if not, I needed to look for a new job. And yes, that was our proposal. I moved to DC in June of 1983, and we married that November. Now, most of you have known Eric for a bit and would probably not call him a romantic. He did love his family deeply, and his other qualities were equally important. He was honest, he was ethical, he believed in the Constitution and law, and for me, he wasn't a Republican. I'm sorry if I just offended some of you. I did say once it was more important that he wasn't a Republican than not being Jewish. We moved to Maine in 1984, and in 1986 and 1987, we welcomed our 2 sons. Our boys, as they have recalled, were the light of his life, and he could often be seen in a dugout or the timekeeper's box while they played baseball and hockey. And I am sure more than one coach got an earful if he felt his boys were not being treated fairly. But most of all, as they have shared, it was his love of golf that he instilled in both boys, as they have made their career paths in some form of golf, and neither of them became social workers. He had several wonderful trips with them, and yes, we did seem to plan many family vacations at or near famous golf courses. And for many years, I got my 10,000 steps walking with him. But it was Doug's daughter, Harper, who came into our lives, and the daughter Eric had always wanted, and he forever had a special place in his heart for Harper. In 2009 or 2010, Eric was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And for many years, he was able to carry on his legal career and remain the chairman of the Maine Property Tax Review Board, a volunteer position that meant a great deal to him. He could finally write those opinions and act like a judge. He continued to run or slog. If any of you have read Michael J. Fox's book, he referred to what he did as a slog as well. But this past June, when it got much hotter in Denver, and he became more unsteady on his walking, he finally gave it up. He was a fighter until the end, often telling one of us that he wanted a glass of scotch or he needed to go to the store to buy some snacks. And more than once, he told me he had to get up and get ready for Josh and Caitlin's wedding, an event that thrilled him. But in the end, his mind and his body just gave in. And he passed away in his sleep sooner than any of us expected or hoped for. He was fond of his high school nickname Bearcat and found numerous T-shirts from colleges who were Bearcats, and we now have quite a collection in our closet. He treasured deeply his copy of the Constitution, signed by Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black. And he loved his family fiercely. We miss you, Bearcat, and we always will. We love you.
I think we need another vocal hug. We love you guys. Wow. I hope I can talk. I got my elephant tie on. Elephants what? Never forget. I'll never forget this funeral. I've done a lot of funerals. Chaplains do far more funerals than they do weddings. And I got this sharing idea a long time ago when I was at my wife's grandmother's funeral in South Portland, when an old preacher there didn't preach. He just went around the circle and had people tell stories. I was like, wow, this is cool. I'm going to try it. And it's always a little uncomfortable sometimes, but I just want to open the floor because, well, let me tell you this. I did it at my grandfather's funeral, which was hard to do. My grandfather and I were real close. But when people started telling stories, I found out things about my grandpa I just never knew from anybody, including the guys who were the grave diggers. They remember during the Depression when my grandpa moved from one house to the new farm he was getting, and the piano was in the back of the pickup truck, and Grammy was playing the piano, and they got to know some people, and he hired them during the Depression to work on the farm. I never would have known those things except for the sharing time. So if you got courage and you can wipe away the tears, do you have something you want to share with the family? Raise your hand. It's okay if you don't.
I'll share something. Okay. So, I first met Eric, I guess at our wedding in 1975, and he was this long-haired lawyer from, well, I guess he was in Baltimore. He might have still been in law school at that point, I'm not really sure. But, then we didn't see them for, I'd see him in the summer, and, it's really when Robbie and Eric moved to Maine, and, Robbie and I became good friends, and our kids were born around the same time. Our daughter Abby is about 3 weeks younger than Josh, even though I think they were due on the same day. And, our younger daughter is, there was a little more space between the two of them, but, the kids grew up together in the summer, and, Eric was just so dedicated to his family and, our family too, the wider family. And he introduced this New York girl to hiking. And I'm not sure my husband will ever forgive him for that. But, we had so many fun times up in Maine and in the mountains, and, I'll just treasure these memories forever.
Thank you for that.
I'm Eric's cousin, and I do remember that he could be blunt. I can't remember any particular instance, so I won't dwell on that. But he was the fun cousin. And the two instances I want to remember is one time I was standing, we had just gotten to Maine and we had stopped at the, Conrad, was it the Stop and Save? Shop and Save, which Father called the Stop and Shave, right? Yeah. So I was standing there looking at a magazine, and all of a sudden somebody came up behind me and turned me upside down. And I just thought that that was such an unright family thing to do. and I appreciated that. I appreciate the people in our family who have kind of broken away a little bit from being so staid. And then the other thing I remember, once again, I didn't know Eric was there. I guess he had just arrived or something, but we were sitting in the Red House, and I was sitting on my favorite place, which was a kind of a chaise covered with a fern coverlet. I think you guys all know it. Right next to the window watching TV, and this big figure comes up to the window and starts scratching on the screen, and I screamed. It was so scary. And of course it was Eric. And once again, it was one of those things that my father and the other right men just would never do. And I appreciated that. And I've always appreciated those things that he would do that were more fun than the rest of the family.
That's great. Anyone else? Brave.
Harper wants to share a story, but she wants me to say it, not for her to say it. Harper's mom, Maggie. My first time to meet Robbie and Eric, I was very largely pregnant, 3 weeks before Harper was due, and they came over to check out all of the baby stuff that we had. And to touch base on what Robbie said earlier, was one of the first things that he said in the very sentimental moment for him was that he was very happy that Harper was a girl, and that he always wanted a daughter, and that he gets to relive a dream through a granddaughter versus having a daughter with his two boys. So Harper wanted me to share that because she really liked that story. I tell her that often, more so lately because Eric had called in September, I think, when he was still in Maine, and he called just wanting to talk to me. And usually it's a Harper moment. I'm the addition to the Harper, which I gladly take. And he told me again of how much he loved Harper and how special she was, and that was his wish of a daughter in the granddaughter form. So she wanted me to share that.
Thank you, Harper.
My name is Mark. I met Eric in probably December of 1962, and we were best friends in high school. And I was the one who gave him the nickname Bearcat, and he was grateful all his life. I think, as Robbie said, he really liked that. And we were junior varsity basketball players, and everybody had to have a nickname. And you can't give yourself a nickname. Somebody else has to give you a nickname. And there was a television program that came from Columbus called Lex's Live Wrestling. It was sponsored by Lex Mayer, who was a local Chevrolet dealer. And one of the wrestlers that was on every week was a guy named Bearcat Wright, and who was fearsome. So that was a natural nickname for Eric. Eric and I were two of three conscientious objectors in our high school class. And Eric worked for 2 years for the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors in Philadelphia. And I know that he was very proud of the work that he did there. And in fact, there was a feature in Parade magazine on him one Sunday, so people all over the country got to see the good work. And I just, that's a memory I wanted to share. We did a lot of traveling together to sporting events and music, seeing music together. I used to tease him that his record collection didn't have anybody who played drums. There was no drumming, although he did like the Rolling Stones. But we went to a U.S. Open together, the one that Lee Trevino won in Rochester. We went to a couple of World Series in Baltimore. And it was a trip that we made leaving Windy Ledge, going to Montreal to see the Expos in Jerry Park, and on to the Baseball Hall of Fame. So, you know, it was, that was Eric. We were very close for a long time.
Thank you for another piece of the puzzle. Well, then, you, Eric, and I were triplets on that one. I was a conscientious objector and was going to Canada out of the Boston group. So we shared that story. Someone else?
My name is Tom Warren, and I'm part of a contingent of people who worked with Eric at the AG's office. And I can be very brief, except to say that I think everybody had tremendous respect for him, both as a person and as a lawyer. But the two things I will tell you is that while he wasn't playing catch with his sons and teaching them how to golf, I used to remember walking into the Brunswick Library on weekends and finding Eric behind a pile of files and books preparing for a trial. He was very, very disciplined and hardworking about his legal work. And the only other thing I will tell you is that I know a few lawyers who defended cases that Eric was prosecuting, and all of those people have told me, and a couple of them repeated it after they learned of his death, that they had really learned to respect, I think one of them called him the curmudgeon, which is, I also heard earlier, but also that they thought how highly ethical and principled he was. So I think that's worth adding.
Another important piece of the puzzle.
So I just wanted to concur with Lizzie. I'm Eric's cousin. I'm the baby of the family, and by a lot of years. So Eric always had a real knack of making me feel included because I wasn't. I was, but I wasn't. I was just so much younger. I didn't have the same interests yet that the rest of the cousins did. I loved going to Windy Ledge. He always made me feel welcome, even till the summer when we laid my mother to rest up there. And they couldn't be there, but they were there.
We'll wind down if there's no more hands. We have one more reading, and that's going to be a Ken Burns reading from Baseball, and that's going to be by Andrew. I'm going to put this up. Thank you, Andrew.
Hello, I'm Andrew. I am Eric's, I guess, only nephew, right? Yeah. And one of my first memories, I remember being back, it was in very early 80s. Since I remember it, I would say I was probably 6, so that'd be 84. And I remember him coming to Cleveland and going through town. Cleveland was where I'm from. And we went to Cleveland Municipal Stadium to watch the Orioles play. And so I do remember that. So very early on, he was checking those stadiums off the list. It measures just 9 inches in circumference, weighs only 5 ounces, and it's made of cork wound with woolen yarn, covered with 2 layers of cowhide, and stitched by hand precisely 216 times. It travels 60 feet, 6 inches from the pitcher's mound to home. It can cover that distance at nearly 100 miles an hour. Along the way, it can be made to twist, spin, curve, wobble, rise, or fall away. The bat is made of turned ash, less than 42 inches long, not more than 2¼ inches in diameter. The batter only has a few thousandths of a second to decide to hit the ball. And yet, the men who fail 7 out of 10 times are considered the game's greatest heroes. Baseball is played everywhere, in parks and playgrounds and prison yards, in back alleys, and in farmers' fields, by small children and old men, by raw amateurs and millionaire professionals. It is a leisurely game that demands blinding speed, and the only one in which the defense has the ball. It follows the seasons, beginning each year with a found expectancy of springtime and ending with the hard facts of autumn. Americans have played baseball for more than 200 years. While they conquered a continent, warred with one another, with enemies abroad, struggled over labor and civil rights and the meaning of freedom. At the game's heart lies the mythic contradictions of democratic sport that tolerates cheating and has excluded as many as it has included. A profoundly conservative game that sometimes manages to be years ahead of its time. It is an American odyssey that links the sons and daughters to fathers and grandfathers. And it reflects a host of old age tensions between workers and owners, scandals and reform, the individuals and the collective. It is a haunted game in which every player is measured against the ghosts of all who have gone before. Most of all, it is about the time and timelessness, speed and grace, failure and loss, imperishable hope and coming home.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Just an announcement before we play the closing musical piece that is a favorite of Eric's called Keep Me at Your Heart. The author has been mentioned earlier. Just want to remind you, if you haven't signed the guest book, it's in the back on the way out. If you do that, please. Nice for the family to have the memory that you were here. And finally, the following reception will be at the Brunswick Golf Club at 165 River Road, not far from here, right here in Brunswick. If you don't have a GPS, talk to one of us who lives here. So we'll play that piece now.
The thing that's different about a Verbo vacation home, you always have the whole place to yourself. No street.
Shadows are falling and I'm running out of breath. Keep me in your heart for a while. If I leave you, it doesn't mean I love you any less. Keep me in your heart for a while. When you get up in the morning and you see that crazy sun, keep me in your heart for a while. There's a train leaving nightly called when all is said and done. Keep me in your heart for a while. Sha-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Keep me in your heart for a while. Sha-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Keep me in your heart for a while. times when you're doing simple things around the house. Maybe you'll think of me and smile. You know I'm tied to you like the buttons on your blouse. Keep me in your heart for a while. Hold me in your thoughts, take me to your dreams, touch me as I fall into view. And when the winter comes, keep the fires lit, and I will be right next to you. Engine drivers headed north to Pleasant Stream. Keep me in your heart for a while. These wheels keep turning, but they're running out of steam. Keep me in your heart for a while. Sha-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Keep me in your heart for a while.